Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Office of Public Instruction on our ESSER guidance session today on pre-approval or large project purchases with ESSER funding. My name is Wendy Fons, and I'm the ESSER and EANS Director for the state of Montana. And with us today also is Rebecca Brown, who is our Program Manager.
Hi, everyone.
So thank you for joining us this afternoon. And our topic today for this guidance session is the pre-approval process or the prior approval process. There are guidance sessions that have been going on all this week. We do have them monthly. They are posted on our website, so you're welcome to follow those in a recorded format as well as the slide deck if you wish to afterwards. So to dive in today, again, as introduction, we will be dealing with the presenters today. So the goals, we have wonderful slide decks here. Our goals for this session are the allowable and reasonable sides of compliance. And what's important to understand in any grant is that you have these guidances that are given by the grantor that talk about allowable uses of the funds. And those are the rules, requirements, and laws that are attached to that. Then there are also some reasonable compliances that have to be met. And they are with regards to setting, practices, standards, and transparency. And so, for example, you could have allowable use of funds, which would allow you to purchase laptops, for example, with ESSER funds. And then the reasonableness might apply to, you can purchase them for 5 students because you only have 5 students in your school, as opposed to another school that might have 100 students and therefore need to purchase 100 of the items. Next slide, please. So when do we need to do a prior approval process with regards to ESSER funding? So there are a couple of different scenarios that you may want to consider as you look forward to doing this pre-approval process. So regardless of funding, if you desire to have updated documentation that supports the use of ESSER funds, both in the allowable side of things and then also in the reasonable side, there is a frequently asked guidance section that you can look at. And that is something that you may want to consider. You know, if you just want to add extra documentation that allows you to really build a substantial support for those use of funds. Providing this documentation that supports the updated guidance from the Department of Education, their most recent one they issued was December 7th of 2022. That helps you to minimize the risk of audit findings. So every time there's a new guidance document that comes out from the Department of Ed, you can actually use those, as we do, to look backwards and say, do I have all the information? Do I have the documentation necessary for an audit finding? And OPI's desire is to support you as districts in the use of those funds as we continue on in the ESSER platform, both with ESSER 2 and 3. ESSER 1 has already expired. The other area that you may want to look at for prior approval is those items that are over $5,000 and involve any kind of capital asset. That prior approval process is part of the ESSER funding requirement. And then if items are under $5,000, or you believe an auditor might question the purchase given the frequently asked question guides on an allowable and reasonable piece, then again, you may want to do this prior approval in terms of using it for best practices. And so you can use it in any of those 3 capacities. Going forward. So the focus on these ESSER fundings is very clearly student gains, and you do need to use that as part of your demonstration for reasonableness. Very few items are disallowed, but there are some that are discouraged. Demonstrating reasonableness is necessary for pre-approval, and all activities charged to ESSER, so any expenditures that you charge in the cash request process to ESSER, the cost must be reasonable and necessary to meet the overall purpose of the program or the grant. And the purpose of that program or grant is to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID, including those circumstances that exacerbate later as you move forward. So we realize that COVID happened. There are still extenuating circumstances that are impacted currently, and so those funds continue on. Next slide, please. So our role at the Office of Public Instruction in the ESSER and EANS section is both as auditors and advocates. We are not auditors, but our function is to help you and support you when you have audit auditors come forward and look at your documentation. So we're looking at both the allowable and reasonable use given federal guidelines. And one of the documents that we use is that frequently asked question, FAQ, that came out in December. And we look at that with all the purchases that are being provided to us. There is a wide range of activities, including indirect, that are linked to the impact of COVID. There's also, in addition to the FAQ, there's an ed volume handbook. And so you can go through that. It provides consistent information on the requirements. And then there's some specific documents that target more specific items like construction or labor shortages. And sometimes the Department of Ed will come out with a more targeted document that comes from, the requirements are coming still from that frequently asked question document, but they've narrowed it down or given a more tighter focus on it. So all those documents are available on our website, and you're welcome to look at those. One of the things that is coming up recently is the liquidation. That if you have a project and you're funding it beyond 24, which would be the end of ESSER 3, that is there a way to extend that? And right now there is not a way to extend. ESSER 1 could be extended, but ESSER 2 and 3, there are no guidance that draws how we can do that at this point. We hope to receive those from the Department of Ed, but right now we don't have them. Next slide, please. So on the capital expenditure asset side, there are a couple of definitions to understand. Capital expenditures are expenditures to acquire capital assets or expenditures to make additions, improvements, modifications, and then a bunch of R's: replacement, rearrangements, reinstallations, renovations, or alternatives to capital assets that materially increase the value or the useful life of a product. So of course, in that definition, if you're an English teacher, you're going to see that they should not be using expenditures, since that's part of the word that you're trying to find a definition for. But in essence, there are a lot of different things that fall under the category of capital expenditure. Under capital asset, we have both tangible and intangible assets used in the operation having a useful life of more than 1 year. So it's really an anchorage on that 1 year use in accordance to, and then there's a guidance section that's there as well from an accounting procedure. Capital assets can include land, facilities or building, equipment, intellectual property, of which they include software, and certain kinds of leases, as well as improvements or modifications. An ESSER can pay for buses, modular classrooms, lead remediation, HVACs, real property acquisition, and a variety of other costs. So when you're looking again at how to expend your ESSER funds, there are a lot of things that the funds are usable for, or they're allowable, and then you just need to look at the how you can use them in your particular setting. Are they reasonable in that setting? Next slide. So recommendations for pre-approval process, how do you sort of look at that to begin with? And one of the things to keep in mind is that the ESSER grant itself allows you to modify what you're spending funds on. So your predecessor a year and a half ago, whether it's the school board or the superintendent, may have had some ideas about how these funds were going to be used based on stakeholder input, so the community input. But now we're 18 months into this, and those ideas have changed. So you really want to look at the existing documentation and history that you have. You want to review those district plans. What were the intent on the first year that ESSER came out, then the next section? These plans have to be updated every 6 months. So you may have some changes in those plans, and you may want to look at those. You want to look at stakeholders' comments. If you've had some comments from the public that have said, you know, we'd really like students to be outside more. We'd like to have some funding spent on our outdoor learning space. Or maybe the public has said they'd really like more after school and summer enrichment programming. And the board has agreed with that. Those may be directions of how these funds are going to be spent. You want to review your current budgets for ESSER 2 and 3. 1 has already been expended, but look at 2 and 3 and see where those budget descriptions lie. What have they described what you're going to spend funding on? And then you want to ask for past projection descriptions. So again, are there any other documents that were created maybe in board minutes of where there were public or the board discussed other uses for the funds? Because again, you're able to modify how these grant funds are used. Then you want to take a look and prioritize those needs within a project, but not pieces basis. So if you decide health for the students is most critical and you've got some mold in certain buildings, maybe you have window and roof repairs, and at some point there was an HVAC that was mentioned. All of those feed into health improvements, air quality. And so looking at it as a project with the goal as opposed to individual pieces will also help. Creating a scope document helps you to pull all those pieces together. So you could pull in windows and you could pull in removal of mold and pull in the HVAC into a health improvement, air quality scope document. And then you'd seek board approval and submit to the pre-approval process and receive approval and then submit an amendment. So you'd be changing your ESSER grant from perhaps doing after-school funding, after-school programming and summer school programming. Instead, you're shoring up your facility to help improve the overall health of students while they're actually at school. So that kind of a change is definitely allowable in ESSER, but it does require this pre-approval process be part of the change as you go through. Next slide, please. So what does that scope document look like? It's really a one-page document, although it can be as long as you want. It's just a Word document, so you can add text in there. And it's really stating what is the problem that you were trying to solve. What process did you use to both identify the problem, but also to remediate the problem? So the problem may be that you discovered that you had a problem with mold. And so how was that discovered? Or you discovered there were contaminants in the water. And so how was that discovered? And then the solution, you might have involved a contractor who came in and gave you an estimate, or maybe DEQ got involved and helped you identify these are some problems. I worked with a district today who was identified as they needed to shore up some of their fire alarms. So that would be a big change for a whole school, is to look at how do we modernize our fire alarm system, or maybe the security system is something that you wish to work with because there've been some challenges in the school over the last year. So it's identifying the scope document really identifies what is the problem that you're trying to solve with these ESSER funds, and then how are you planning to go about solving that problem? And you put a title, a general description, when you've brought it to the board and it's been approved, the cost of the project. And part of the cost is not just identifying the ESSER funds, but are the costs also coming from other entities? So we had a school district who was doing an outdoor learning space, and their foundation, their PTA-like foundation, was basically paying for half the funds. So they really got that group very involved in the decision-making and the actual implementation of that outdoor learning space. So you'd want to document that in your funding source. And then the timeline. If it's a large project, you may actually have it in phases. The first phase could simply be architectural design. So you have entities come in and bid to do that design, and then you look at their proposed solutions and present that to the board. That could actually be paid for out of ESSER. And then you determine, whoa, we really wanted to do this outdoor learning space as we have initially designed it, but it's going to cost $2 million and we only have $500,000. So we're going to have to change our scope. And you can use this document to make sort of change orders or changes in what you're implementing. The next section talks about student gains and the PPR, which is prepare, prevent, and respond. So that's a section you really want to identify directly to students. So if we take the HVAC area, you might say that you're improving, that the gain there is that you are improving your school building, and you're modernizing. If it's a security or data improvement, you might say, data modernization is the goal and the gain that you have there. But what specifically are you gaining for your students? So you're decreasing their absenteeism by increasing attendance, because you are reducing the spread of infection, because now you have a good air ventilation system in the school. That would be something to anchor on students, rather than saying you're improving the HVAC system in the building. So it's very specifically anchored on student gains. Depreciated items, you'd be listing the items there that would be depreciated. And then the meaningful stakeholder input, again, identifying what entities, what organizations, what types of individuals have come together to give input, and what method you've used for that input. Did you do surveys? Did you put it out on Facebook to all the parents? Did you send out text? Did you send out a hard copy newsletter? There are many different ways that you can get meaningful stakeholder input. And then lastly, the bottom section is identifying options considered. So part of what's happening with ESSER is, if whether it's the public or whether it's the grantor, the federal government, asking in an annual report, why have you spent your money this way instead of a different way? So it's documenting, this is how we came to this conclusion to solve or resolve the problem that we were facing. And option one can frequently just be leave the situation as is. In other words, we identified that there was a problem with our air quality, but the cost was too high and we decided we weren't going to use the money that way. So the description might be install an HVAC system, but the challenge was it was too expensive and it would take too long to install. It would go beyond the date of the grant. The gain is then, by leaving the system the way it is that you have those funds to use in a different mode. On the other hand, the option 3 is the one you're recommending. So there, it could be health improvement involving air quality and installing new windows and an HVAC system and cleaning up mold or maybe even carpets that are contributing to your air quality. And the challenges still might be timing. You're still looking at, how are we going to get this done before September 2024, but the gain is you have a much cleaner and healthier environment for your students. And therefore, again, absenteeism will go down and attendance will go up, and engaged students will be a product of that. So that's kind of how you walk through that particular document, the scope document. Again, it's just a Word document. You can type as long, as big, it just expands. And then you upload that into a portal. Next slide, please. The portal that you upload it into looks a little bit like this. It does capture your name, in your email address and name. And so what will happen is, when you're finished submitting and uploading, it will send you back a confirmation notice. So once you submit it, the system will actually let you know, yes, we've received this. And you do want to check that and make sure that things aren't going to your spam, because the way that both e-grants and this form and other modes of communication in the ESSER grant, many of those are auto-generated, but they're important to keep. So you do want to keep the emails coming back to you. If you don't get the correct email, if you don't get confirmation, please let us know, because we do need to check that and find out why that's not coming to you. I know sometimes things go to spam, but important to check. In the portal itself, you're going to be entering in your name and contact information, uploading the project scope, and then you're going to review and agree to the compliances. So there are many that are in there that talked about cost principles and audit requirements, and you do need to put that information into the portal. You can copy and paste a lot of the information that's in the scope. So the scope document is just a way to work outside of the portal. It doesn't have limits on character count or formatting, and then you can just cut and paste into the form itself online. Next slide, please. Once you're finished with the prior approval process, then what you may do is go through and do an amendment. So again, taking the scenario that last year, the things that you had in the budget have slightly changed, and so you're going to change your fund categories. You may have allocated them to a 600 supply category, and instead you're going, no, I really want to do an HVAC system. Our school board met, we had input from our students and our community and teachers, and we really want to shore up the air quality in our buildings. So you would be changing budget categories, and you just, again, use that project title that came from the scope document. You put board approval date, OPI approval date, and then from category to category for the purpose of, in response, prepare, prevent, that PPR, and any specific student gains. One of the things that happens in eGrants is it is a character count. So abbreviations are very welcomed. You're welcome to do that. And somebody asked me actually whether or not why they couldn't get the color coding to work in eGrants. And unfortunately, eGrants works in the black and white world. It does not work in the color coded world. So this template that we show you is just to sort of help identify the different sections, but same kind of language, just plop it right in as an amendment. Next slide, please. So the approval of a project is really based on looking at that frequently asked question document. So we go and we look in there and say, is the item something that is allowable? And then we're looking at the reasonableness of something. We're looking for clearly identified goals that relate to ESSER, prepare, prevent, respond, and those student outcomes. Is it a cost-effective solution? In other words, have you looked at alternatives? And are there any barriers that need to be overcome? So one of the barriers we will sometimes see is that if a district is allocating funds, say for a professional development contract that's, $200,000 and it spans into the year 2026, we would need to have a conversation with the district to help them reconsider that, because the grant funding ends in 24. Now, one way that could be supported would be if ESSER funding was used for the 23 year and the 24 year, but then foundational funds were used for the 25 and 26 year. So the project itself would still remain the same, but the funding sources would be filled by year. And that way it could be approved, but the ESSER funding itself just couldn't be used beyond that 24 date. You also really want to look at the amendments and the budgets, and that's a process we do, is just to make sure that the amendment that you're putting through does match with something that's happening in the budget. And so when you make a change in an amendment that references that to and from, you want to make sure that you also update the budget section itself, those budget descriptions. Next slide. So to close today, I just want to identify this again as the ESSER team. You have many people that you can contact via email as well as contact via the phone. You can reach out at any time. We all keep in contact with each other frequently during the week. However, there are different people to contact as an initial contact. Anything that is dealing with cash requests, you want to reach out to Stephen Morgan on that. If it has to do with amendments, generally Rebecca Brown is doing that. And I tend to work within these larger projects and the pre-approval side. And Jessica, who just came on board with us, she is helping in many different capacities. So she helps support the whole functioning. Mindy helps a tremendous amount with regards to technical support in eGrant. So that's this whole team. We all do work together in what we're doing and back each other up. But there's some particular points of contact that you can reach out to. Again, email or phone is very good. If you email us, please do put in the subject line the name of your school district or entity in complete, not an abbreviated form, and then the LE number, the number that you use when you're getting into eGrants, and that will really help us answer your questions faster. So I'm just going to pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions. There is like a 15-second delay, but feel free to put those questions into the chat session. You can also, as I said, follow up later with questions via the phone or email. So I'll just pause for a second and see if there are any questions in the chat. Okay, seeing none, if you can just display the next slide.